In this video we'll be making a website in one line of code. But wait, I can't simply make a website like this one. Of course, I will not make Apple's website either, but I'll try to make one that doesn't look too bad. And for that, we are going to have 3 rules. The first one, I can only write in one line, so I have no access to external files. It also needs to be pretty somehow, can't be too ugly. And the third rule is dynamic. The website needs to be somehow dynamic elements, and some information that goes from an API or from a database. The very first step, even if we are going to develop a very simple website, is the idea, the plan. The website thematic is going to be who is this Pokémon? We are going to generate a black image of a Pokémon, and then we will show 4 Pokémon names. Every time the user guesses it right, we give him a point. And when he finally gets it wrong, we show him his score and just ask if he wants to play again. We just refresh the page. For the website scheme, we just put a pretty background with an intuitive title, who is this Pokémon, right? We also put a circle for the Pokémon and its black image. We put a group of 4 possible answer buttons more to the right, like a cross between them. And finally, at the bottom right corner, we just put the number, the score. And now that I look at it, making the CSS might get a little bit handful because of all of those displays, but let's not worry too much about it now. You can also make a very fast game over screen. Since we are already at it, you just put a text with the game over, really big so the user knows. Max score with a dynamic number that would probably come from the score down here, and a play again button, which will refresh the page and allow the user to play again. As you might have expected, we'll be using HTML and CSS to make things look on point, or just barely acceptable, actually. And since we'll only use one line of code, we will firstly need to generate an HTML boilerplate and put everything in the first line. And one thing that I learned really early on is how to scroll horizontally. Yes, you can use the scroll bar down there. However, if you use the shift with the scroll wheel, we will be scrolling horizontally, like I wanted. It ended up being pretty useful throughout this challenge. Now we need to sort of decide the structure of our HTML, which is going to be pretty simple, with 2 sections, game over and quiz. We'll be starting by the quiz. For the quiz we'll be using a title, a division for the dynamic content, basically the quiz elements. Then we'll divide the screen in half. The left side, which is going to have a circle, and inside of the circle the Pokémon in black, and at the right we'll have 2 divisions. One for the 4 buttons, with the Pokémon's names, and another division for the score, the current score of the user. Hey yo, it is already looking kinda shit! No, it's HTML, we can't expect too much. And now, we are already ready for the second section, which is going to be the game over section. We are simply going to have a title, game over, of course, the max score with a dynamic placeholder for when we want to put the score, and a button, the play again button. As you can see, it got even worse! Again, it's just HTML, we still haven't applied any CSS or JavaScript yet. And as you might have already expected, I'll be using a lot of the inspect element tools, so I can check HTML not in one line of code, because it's not a simple task to understand one line of code, so I hope you don't mind me using it. And since we have already applied some classes to our HTML tags, the next step is to create our CSS stylings. And since we are not really able to use external files, we'll need to use the style tag to style our own document. We can use the style tag in the body or in the head, but I'll be putting it in the head so everything gets a little bit more organized. And the very first step for our styling is not actually for the style tag, but an inline style. We'll be hiding the section of the game over, since we only want to see a section per time. So if we are playing, we still haven't reached the game over. And if we reach the game over, we want to hide the quiz so the player doesn't continue to play and it's game over. So let's hide the section of the game over. We'll also divide the styling process in 3 steps. The placement, so the display and where things are going to be, sizing things up, paddings, margins and the size of letters and stuff. And lastly, the third one is going to be about colors, about changing the color, the background color, and some little effects. And for the placement, for the quiz, we are going to increase the width and the height to the max view, make sure to use those viewport units. We are going to make the quiz title to text align center, so it's right in the center of your screen, and my screen as well. The quiz elements should be of display flags. We should justify with space evenly, align items to the center, and for the height, I'll put a magic number of 75. And any other number, it is not going to be where I want it to be. So 75 it is. For the answer div, we are going to make it grid, so we have a square 2x2 of buttons, with the template columns and rows, and we are also going to apply a gap. Not a perfect 3x3, but instead a 3x5. Since the sizes are not really the same, it gets a little bit more natural. And finally, the right side is going to also become flex. The height is going to be the same 75 view height. We are going to align items by the flex end, and we are also going to make the answer div to get to be aligned self to center. In here, the opposite could also be done. However, I chose to do it this way. For the sizes, let's set the title to a font size of 5 view widths. We'll also make the image div a circle with a border radius of 50%. Then the image, the Pokémon image, gets to be 15 rem width. The answer button is going to have a font size of extra large and a padding 140 rem. Lastly, let's not forget to change the font size of the score, so the user can see the 0 really big. Now, we are going to paint our website up. We are going to firstly create the template class, which is for the Pokémon image, in which you just apply a filter of brightness to 0%, so any color becomes black. The format is still there, so you can see slightly the shape of the Pokémon. We are also going to set the cursor pointer events to none, so the user won't be able to cheat, won't be able to drag the image and see the perfect image with colors and stuff. We don't want that, no cheaters allowed. We're also going to apply a background for the quiz, a nice greyish black background. We're also going to change the background for the image, the circle, blue, really nice color. And you're also going to apply the same color to the title. The score span, the one that is with the 0, the big 0, you're going to set it to white, so it gets a little bit easier to see in such dark background. Let's also change the color of the button to that light blue that we like, and remove the border. It looks better without it, right? We're also going to apply a hover effect and an active color, which is basically hover slightly lighter, active slightly darker. Our website also deserves a custom font, so we just head to the Google Fonts website, search for the font that we want, select the exact font weight you want for that same font family, just import it into our CSS and say that the font family is that one that you just installed. Before heading to the game over screen, one thing that would be really great to add to our website would be the transition. We're just going to add a transition, a small one of 200 milliseconds. Nothing more, nothing less. However, we are not going to apply it to a selector, to a class, or to an ID, or to a group of elements. Instead, we are going to apply it globally, so everything is going to get smoother throughout our website. In order to style our game over screen, we'll first remove the display none from the game over section and put it in the quiz section. That way, hiding what we don't want to see and only showing what we want to see. Then, for placements, we'll be having the game over container display flex and justify and align it to the center. We are going to increase the height to maximum, change the flex direction to column, so the title, the score and the button go one after the other. You're going to also align the text to the center and add a flex gap of 10 rem, so everything gets well spaced up. For sizes, we'll be having the game over title with a font size of 10 rem, the game over score with a font size of 3 rem, of course the score included, and you're also going to have the game over button with a font size of 3 rem and a padding of 0 to rem. So we get more padding to the sides, however in the top and the bottom doesn't receive much padding. And finally, for the coloring of the game over, we are going to set the background for a slightly darker gray than we did for the quiz. The game over color is going to be white. And something I had forgotten, let's add the cursor pointer to all of our buttons. This way, making all of our buttons seem clickable with that little hand. With both screens styled, we will be able to jump into the logic of our application with JavaScript. Before changing the display to the quiz again, we are going to firstly apply the onClick functionality on the play again button, which is onClick, that HTML property. We are going to execute the JavaScript function location.reload with the parentheses. So, when we click in the play again, the page reloads, which will avoid complexity, unnecessary complexity for our code. We just reload and play another game. And now, you are finally ready to start the quiz logic. To write our JavaScript, we can simply write a script tag in HTML and specify the source, which is basically going to be where the file is. But wait, one of the rules of this challenge specifies that we can't really use external files, so we will need to write it right here in our HTML document, between the script tag, just like we did with the styles. Now, let's cover the JavaScript step by step. Being the first step, getting the name of all of the Pokémons that we can through the API. And to get the name of all of the Pokémons through an API, we will need to create a variable to store all of the Pokémon names. We'll also need to use the fetch with an URL. I've used this API, the Poké API, and I've used this query, so I could get all of the Pokémons, the maximum really. And this API, as you can see, returns a JSON string with all of the names and a link associated with the Pokémon name. And since we don't want that, we'll need to discard it later. So, the first step after the fetch is going to be using the then to handle the promise the fetch returned. We are going to receive a response, and we want to convert that JSON string response into a JavaScript object. Then, since you already have the data, which is an array with the Pokémon name and the link, we want to receive an array of the same size, however, with only the name of the Pokémon. We don't want anything else. And then we just need to push all of the Pokémons into the Pokémon names, our variable. And we'll be using the spread operator, since the push method of the arrays accepts multiple values at a time. So we'll be able to push every single name of the array of names into the Pokémon's names. There are other ways of doing this, but this is the fastest one, in my opinion. Then you just console log the Pokémon names. And in the case that something wrong happens with the fetch, we just catch the error and log it in the console. And as you can see, all of the 1000 Pokémons are here. And if you guys have class just like me, you will probably want a function that handles everything after the success of all of the steps for the fetching, so we don't put it all in the same then. We'll have a function that handles it all. The next thing would be generating the Pokémon. And to do it, we can create a random function that goes from 0 to the length of the Pokémon's array. That is, if everything were perfect. However, the API I'm using for the images only go up to 1010, so it needs to be smaller than 1010. That function will then return Pokémon's position, and you can use it to assign a value to the current Pokémon. So you just need to create a current Pokémon variable, and it needs to be let or var, since it's going to change every round if the user gets it right at least one time. And that current Pokémon variable can be assigned right after all of the names are fetched, so we can put it inside of the function handle after fetch. But wait! For the user experience, there is a slight problem. The higher the number of the Pokémon, the more unusual he will be, so not so many people will know him. And if we put the 1000 Pokémons right from the start, the user probably won't guess it right. So a nice way of managing that difficulty level is by creating a variable, which could be something like the difficulty level, and it starts by 50. So only the first 50 Pokémons will be assigned to that possible current Pokémon. And every time the user gets it right, we could increase 10. So every time he guesses it right, the difficulty may increase. And now, with the Pokémon already selected, we can create these two functions. One that fills the answer buttons, because they currently have only placeholders, and the other that gets the Pokémon image and puts it into the website, because the image needs to be dynamic according to the correct Pokémon. Now, let's fill those buttons with some Pokémons. First step is to create an array, which is going to store all of the Pokémons that are for the display. Then we are going to create a function, and that function is going to have a variable to store the Pokémon. We are going to insert already the right Pokémon into the Pokémon to display, and inside of the while, we are going to generate a Pokémon, put it inside of that variable that we created in this function. We are going to verify if it is already in the array or not, because we don't want multiple Pokémon with the same name, especially if it is the right Pokémon. We don't want it 2 times, no. And if it isn't already in the Pokémon to display, we add it. While the array still hasn't the 4 Pokémons, 1 for each button, we will continue to generate and try to add more Pokémons until we fill all the buttons. And lastly, we'll shuffle the Pokémons to display. And in my opinion, shuffle should be already be in JavaScript default array functions, just like the sort as an example. So I'm just going to copy a shuffle function and paste it right there. And since you already have this function sort of finished, we can already add it to the handle after fetch function. And as you can see through the console, it's already filling the array. And it seems to have a problem. Names are repeating, and yes, it's because I misspelled a word. Instead of generate, it's the generated. My bad. But now, it's working perfectly fine. No repetitions are allowed inside of this array anymore. And the reason I previously said that it was sort of finished is because fill buttons, but it doesn't fill buttons actually. And in order to fill those buttons, we'll need to get all of them through the DOM. I've chosen the document.query selector all, so we select every button with the class .answerButton. Then we'll be using a normal for loop, because this way we can run through every button or every Pokémon, the 4 of them, and assign, first Pokémon, first button, second Pokémon, second button, and so on. With this, all of the buttons are already being filled dynamically. And the next function is going to update the image into one of the Pokémons that are being displayed in the buttons. We're also going to get the image of the Pokémon through an API. And the best way of doing that is by using this API, which just receives a number and a .png, which corresponds to a Pokémon image. And for our luck, that number is the index of each of our Pokémons in the Pokémon's names array, plus 1. Index plus 1, very simple. So we just need to find the current Pokémon in the Pokémon's array, then we have the index, increment plus 1, and just put that number inside of the URL of the API. So you put all of the API / the number .png. This way we update the source of our image dynamically with our API. And with the image and buttons filled, if we want to, we can already remove the placeholders, which were random Pokémon names and the Pikachu image. Now we don't even need placeholders. With our Pokémons becoming dynamic, we are finally able to start dealing with new rounds, do the score management, and get to the game over screen. Do you want to know which of the 3 functions we are going to make first? It's pretty obvious. The easiest one, of course. So, let's start by the increment score. To increment the score, we need to get the dynamic score through the DOM, convert that value that's inside of it into an integer, make the sum, because if you don't convert it previously to integer, it is going to concatenate, which we don't want. And another thing that also fits perfectly inside of this function is the difficulty management. If we haven't still reached the 1010 Pokémon maximum, which is from the images, we can still add more Pokémons. And the more Pokémons we get into the thingy, especially those strange Pokémons, the harder it gets. So what about we increment 10 more Pokémons into the difficulty every time the user gets it right? When I said 3 functions, you know I was kidding, right? Because before managing the next round, you probably need to verify if the user actually deserves to go to the next round or not. So we sort of need to validate the answer. And to do that, we'll create a function that receives a button ID. So we not only will click with the button, but we will also send the ID through the parameter. And with the ID of the button, we'll have access to it. We'll have access to the name that's written in the button, and we can compare it to the correct Pokémon's name. Just by doing that, we can already console log if it is correct or wrong. But this function will also have a trick. How do we call it? We don't call it after fetching. Of course not. We'll need to create an on-click property in the HTML button, and every time we click, we want the JavaScript to execute the validate answer, which parameter is the string of the ID of the button. And as you can see, we don't even need to send the ID of the button anymore through the console. We click and receive the feedback, the immediate feedback through the console. I liked it. So the only thing left is to make the supportive functions that will allow the user experience to skyrocket. Have you ever used any website in which you needed to go to the console to check if you did something right or wrong? Of course not. So we'll be having functions to change the color of the button. We'll also need to reset the button, the color and its changes. And every time the user answers, we probably also want to show the colors of the Pokémon. That way the user can say, no, this was Pikachu. No, it wasn't Pikachu. The Pikachu isn't blue. And the first from the multiple supportive functions is going to be the title Pokémon image color. And to make it, we just need to get the image, verify if that image through DOM inside of its class list contains turn black, we remove it. If it doesn't, which is the else, we add it. And this is how you make a really simple class toggle with JavaScript and CSS. Have you ever wanted to change the color of your buttons depending on the answer that the user gives? Well, now we'll do it. The both correct and incorrect button color are basically two different things, but also the same. We just need to create a class that changes the background color to red or green depending on what you want. We are going to make two selectors of those in CSS, and then we need to create a function that receives the button ID, access the button ID through the DOM, and is going to add to the class list of that button the class of correct or incorrect. Depends on the function that you were working with. Since our buttons are already full of colors, we should also make a function that resets all of the buttons of the Pokémons. For that, we need to access all of the buttons, go for each and every single one of them, and then we need to verify if it has either the correct button or the incorrect button classes from CSS. And if it does have, we remove it, because we want our buttons ready at the start of each round. Now, the last supportive method, which is going to be the answer selected. Yeah, I didn't mention it, but I thought this method would be really great. In this method, we get all of the buttons, we find the button which had the correct Pokémon and make it green, and we disable all of the buttons. And this is normally used after the user clicks on the button, chooses a Pokémon. And now it is finally time to implement those methods. The first method we'll be adding is the answer selected. We disable all of those buttons, and we are also going to select the right Pokémon button. We will also toggle the image of the Pokémon so we can see it now. And every time the user doesn't guess it right, we just select the button he clicked as red, as incorrect. Then, after we wait around 2.5 seconds, the time really doesn't matter too much, I'd like to have a next round, or, if the answer was incorrect, a game over. The easiest way of creating a new round function is by reutilizing the old functions that we have already made. So we'll need to reset all of the button colors. There are no reds and greens around our buttons. We will also need to create a new correct Pokémon. It could be the same, but we generate a new one anyways. We'll also toggle the Pokémon's image color. We want our Pokémon to become black again. And then we'll fill the buttons with new random Pokémons. And at the moment we fill the buttons with Pokémons, we also update the Pokémon's image. Oh, and we forgot something, right? When we reset all the buttons, we also want to make the buttons able again. Because we turned them off after we answered, right? But now, for the next round, we need to remove the green, the red, and also turn on the buttons. Now we will also make the function that calls the game over. The game over will do a bunch of things, but the first one is going to be getting the dynamic score from the game and putting into the max score that the user got. we should also turn off the display of the quiz and make the game over with the display of flags. Not block, but in the CSS we use flags, so we need to keep it flags. And the game over will be called when the user doesn't get it right and 2 seconds or so has passed. Now, to make the delay before the next round or the game over, we'll need to create a variable that is going to hold was the answer correct or not. In the case that it was right, we set the variable to true. In the case that the answer was wrong, we set the variable to false. And later on, we are going to use the set timeout to wait for 2 seconds and a half. And if the answer was right, we go to the next round. If not, it's game over. Ooh, and we got an exception. We got an error. We'll leave it for later, but we are going to solve it for sure. Just not now. As you can see, the game over is working perfectly after the time that we wait for the game over screen. But there is a slight problem with the next round. It seems that the Pokémon image isn't really being updated. So, let's update it. Remember that error, that exception. Let's tackle now that cannot read properties of undefined. It seems like something is undefined. Let's check it out. I guess it has to be with the Pokémon to display array. Since I wanted to fill the array every round, but I never cleared it, it was always full, it either hadn't space for more Pokémons, or if it had, the Pokémons that were being displayed in the buttons were not really the ones we wanted, since we always use the first 4 Pokémons to put into the buttons. So either way, the correct Pokémon was never being displayed in the buttons. And now, as you can see, everything is working as expected. We can play the game, we can click on the buttons, we get the feedback, and the next round is managed. And if you don't want to find errors like this one when you are working with arrays, make sure to watch this video, JavaScript Arrays for Dummies. There are still a lot of functionalities that could be added to our application, but you should know when to stop. This video is already a little bit too big, and the line of code is giant. But one last thing should be applied. Encapsulating our project, the whole JavaScript. So that way, the user, instead of writing the name of the variables and finding the correct Pokémon value as we have been doing, those variables will seem to be undefined, but they are working and they are hidden, anonymous. To use a closure, or to make our JavaScript as a closure, we just need to create a function, we don't need a name, we put the parentheses and the curly braces all around our project, all around our JavaScript. Then we put a pair of parentheses around our function start to end, and with an extra pair of parentheses we can execute this closure and assign its functionality to the global scope. And since the function doesn't have a name, you can't even know how the function was created. And this way, everything should work except for one thing. The on-click events were created on the HTML side, but now, since those HTML on-click events are trying to access functions in the global scope, in which they aren't, we'll need to make the event listeners on the JavaScript side, instead of the closure, where the functions were created, were defined. And in order to make that event listeners work again, we just need to use the document.query selector, select the ID of each individual button, and add click event listener. Then we need to create a callback function that will return the validate answer button. So when we click, we are in reality executing the validate answer. This way it could be a little bit hard to understand. If it were in HTML it would be easier. However, this is how you do it with the DOM. And before wrapping up, I'm just going to choose a favicon and apply it into our website, so when you try to access it, it at least has a favicon. And now, if you are interested in how you could also make an application like the one we made together, you can subscribe to the channel and look for the videos you are most interested in. Of course, if you are interested in our game, click in the first link in the description to try it out. And finally, this was our website in one line of code.